Section 15 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 6, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This recording is in the public domain. Elisabeth, Chapter 5, Part 1. The evidences of history prove that religious persecution generates faction, and lends the most formidable weapons to the disaffected by dignifying treason with the name of piety. Thus it was in the Pilgrimage of Grace in the reign of Henry VIII, with Kett's rebellion in that of Edward VI, and the Wyatt insurrection in that of Mary. Whether under the rival names of Catholic or Protestant, the principle was the same, and the crown of martyrdom was claimed by the sufferer for conscience sake of either party. The experience of the religious struggles in the last three reigns had failed to teach Elizabeth the futility of monarchs attempting to make their opinions on theological matters a rule for the consciences of their subjects. Her first act of intolerance was levelled against the Anabaptists by the publication of an edict in which they and other heretics, whether foreign or native, were enjoined to depart the realm within 20 days, on pain of imprisonment and forfeiture of goods. Subsequently, in a fruitless attempt to establish uniformity of worship throughout the realm, she treated her dissenting subjects of all classes with great severity, as well as those who adhered to the tenets of the Church of Rome. The attempt to force persons of opposite opinions to a reluctant conformity with the newly established ritual rendered it distasteful to many, who would probably, if left to the exercise of their own discretion, have adopted it in time, as the happy medium between the two extremes of Rome and Geneva. In Ireland, coercive measures were followed by disaffection and revolt, and opened the door to plots and perpetual enterprises against the Queen's person and government, both from foreign powers and those within her own realm, who were desirous of being governed by a sovereign of their own creed. On the first day of 1562, the Queen went in state to St. Paul's Cathedral. The Dean, having notice of her intention, had been at some pains and great expense in ornamenting a prayer book with beautiful prints, illustrative of the history of the apostles and martyrs, which were placed at the epistles and gospels appointed to be read by the Church of England on their commemorations. The book, being intended as a New Year's gift for her Majesty, was richly bound, and laid on the cushion for her use. A proclamation had, indeed, lately been set forth, to please the Puritan party, against images, pictures, and Romish relics, but as Elizabeth continued to retain a large silver crucifix over the altar of the Chapel Royal, with candlesticks and other ornaments, the use or disuse of which might be regarded rather as a matter of taste than religion, the Dean supposed that her Majesty did not object to works of art on scriptural subjects, as embellishments for her books of devotion. Elizabeth, however, thought it expedient to get up a little scene on this occasion, in order to manifest her zeal against popery before a multitude. When she came to her place, she opened the book, but, seeing the pictures, frowned, blushed, and shut it, of which several took notice, and calling to the verger, bade him bring her the book she was accustomed to use. After the service was concluded, she went straight into the vestry, where she asked the Dean, how that book came to be placed on her cushion? He replied, that he intended it as a New Year's gift to her Majesty. You never could present me with a worse, rejoined the Queen. Why so? asked the Dean. Her Majesty, after a vehement protestation of her aversion to idolatry, reminded him of her recent proclamation against superstitious pictures and images, and asked, if it had been read in his deanery? The Dean replied, that it had, but he meant no harm in causing the prints to be bound up in the service book. She told him, that he must be very ignorant indeed to do so after her prohibition. The poor Dean humbly suggested, that if so, her Majesty might the better pardon him. The Queen prayed, that God would grant him a better spirit and more wisdom for the future. To which royal petition in his behalf, the Dean meekly cried, Amen. Then the Queen asked, how he came by the pictures and by whom engraved? He said, he bought them of a German, and her Majesty observed, it is well it was from a stranger, Had it been any of our subjects, we should have questioned the matter. The menace, implied in this speech, against native artists, who should venture to engrave plates with scriptural subjects, naturally deterred them from copying the immortal works of the great Flemish, Italian, and Spanish masters, which were chiefly confined to themes from sacred history or saintly lore, and may well explain the otherwise unaccountable fact that the pictorial arts in England retrograded, instead of improved, from the accession of Elizabeth till the reign of Charles I. About this time, Margaret, Countess of Lennox, the queen's nearest relation of the royal Tudor blood, and who stood next to the Queen of Scots in the hereditary order of the regal succession, was arrested and thrown into prison. Her ostensible offence was, having corresponded secretly with her royal niece, the Queen of Scots; but, having been the favourite friend of the late queen, who was at one time reported to have intended to appoint her as her successor to the prejudice of Elizabeth, that princess had cherished great ill will against her, and she now caused her to be arraigned on the formidable charges of treason and witchcraft. The countess was, with 4 others, found guilty of having consulted with pretended wizards and conjurers, to learn how long the queen had to live. The luckless lady, being perfectly aware that the royal animosity proceeded from a deeper root, addressed the following curious letter in her own justification to Mr. Secretary Cecil. Good Master Secretary, I have received your answer by my man Fowler upon the queen's words to you, whereby the queen hath been informed, and doth credit the same, that I, in the time of her highness's trouble in Queen Mary's reign, should be rather a means to augment the same than diminish it, in putting it then in Queen Mary's head, that it was a quietness for the times to have her shut up. Master Secretary, none on live, or alive, is able to justify this false and untrue report made of me, among others the like, as therein I will be sworn, if I were put to it, that never, in all my life, I had, or meant to have, said such words touching the queen's majesty, nor I, for my part, bear no such stroke to give any advice in any such weighty matter. But what should I say? Even as my lord and I have had extremity showed upon the informations most untruly given unto the queen's majesty of us so late, I for no other, but the continuance thereof, as long as her highness doth hear and credit the first tale, without proof to be tried, and, as it appeareth, discrediteth my answers any way made to the contrary, how true soever they be. But if my lord and I might find the queen's majesty so good and gracious to us, as to hear our accusers and us, face to face, I would then be out of doubt to find shortly some part of her highness's favour again, which I beseech you to be a means for, and to participate the contents of this my letter to her majesty, in which doing ye give me occasion to be ready to requite the same as my power shall extend. And so, with hearty commendations, I bid you likewise farewell. From Chathis, the 2nd of October, your assured friend to my power, Margaret, Lennox, and Angus. Margaret had some cause of alarm when she penned this earnest letter, for her life lay at the mercy of the queen, and the accusation of sorcery against royal ladies had hitherto generally emanated either from the hatred or rapacity of the sovereign. In the autumn of 1562, the queen was attacked with a long and dangerous illness, and an astrologer named Prestel, who had cast her nativity, predicted that she would die in the ensuing March. This prophecy, becoming very generally whispered abroad, inspired 2 royally descended brothers of the name of Pole, the representatives of the line of Clarence, with the wild project of raising a body of troops, and landing them in Wales, to proclaim Mary Stuart queen, in the event of her majesty's death, in the hope that the beautiful heiress of the crown would reward one of them with her hand, and the other with the dukedom of Clarence. This romantic plot transpired, and the brothers with their confederates were arraigned for high treason. They protested their innocence of conspiring against the queen, but confessed to having placed implicit reliance on the prediction of Prestel, and that their plot only involved the matter of the succession. It appears probable that this political soothsaying was connected with the misdemeanour of Lady Lennox. Cecil laboured hard to construe the visionary scheme of the deluded young men into a confederacy of the Guises and Mary Queen of Scots, but the notion was too absurd. They were condemned to die, but Elizabeth, having no reason to suppose they had practised against her life, revolted at that time from the thoughts of shedding kindred blood on the scaffold on a pretence so frivolous. She graciously extended her pardon to Arthur Pole and his brother, and allowed them to pass beyond sea. On the last of December this year, Mistress Smythson, her Majesty's launderer, was presented by the royal command with a kirtle of russet satin, edged with velvet and lined with russet taffeta. The materials of this rich but simple dress prove that the office of launderess to the sovereign was held by a gentlewoman, whose duty it was to superintend the labours of the operative naiads of the royal household. The queen in her royal robes, with her bishops and peers, rode in great state, from her palace, January 12, 1563, to open the parliament at Westminster. She proceeded first to the Abbey, and alighting at Our Lady of Grace's chapel, where she and her noble and stately retinue entered at the north door, and heard a sermon preached by Noel, the Dean of St. Paul's. And then a psalm being sung, she proceeded through the south door to the Parliament chamber, then evidently held in the chapter house. The first step taken by this Parliament, after the choice of a speaker, was to petition the Queen to marry. This, indeed, appeared the only means of averting the long and bloody successive wars, with which, according to human probability, the rival claimants of the female descendants of Henry VII threatened the nation, in the event of Elizabeth dying without lawful issue of her own. The elements of deadly debate, which Henry VIII had left as his last legacy to England, by his arbitrary innovations in the regular order of succession, had been augmented by Elizabeth's refusal to acknowledge the rights of the Queen of Scots as the presumptive inheritor of the throne. The cruel policy which had led her to nullify the marriage and stigmatize the offspring of the hapless representative of the Suffolk line had apparently provided further perplexities and occasions of strife. With this stormy perspective, the people naturally regarded the life of the reigning sovereign as their best security against the renewal of struggles, no less direful than the Wars of the Roses. In this idea Elizabeth wished them to remain, and it was no part of her intention to lessen the difficulties in which the perilous question of heirship to the crown was involved. "Oh, how wretched are we," writes Bishop Jewel to his friend at Zurich, "who cannot tell under what sovereign we are to live!" Elizabeth briefly replied to the remonstrance of her Parliament on this subject, and that of her marriage, that she had not forgotten the suit of the house, nor ever could forget it, but it was a matter in which she would be advised. Elizabeth was just then too busily occupied in traversing every proposal of marriage that had been made to the Queen of Scots to have leisure to think much of her own. Since the widowhood of Mary Stuart, all Elizabeth's rejected suitors had transferred their addresses to the younger and fairer queen of the sister realm, and nothing but the political expediency of maintaining the guise of friendship she had assumed towards Mary prevented her from manifesting the jealousy and ill will excited in her haughty spirit by every fresh circumstance of the kind. Mary very obligingly communicated all her offers to her good sister of England, having promised to be guided by her advice on this important subject, and all were equally objectionable in Elizabeth's opinion. Mary, in the morning freshness of youth, beauty, and poetic genius, cared for none of these things. Her heart was long faithful to the memory of her buried lord, and she allowed Elizabeth to dictate refusals to her illustrious wooers with perfect unconcern, in the hope that in return for this singular condescension her good sister would be won upon to acknowledge her right to succeed to the crown of England, in the event of that queen dying without lawful issue. Elizabeth was inflexible in her refusal to concede this point. She replied, that the right of succession to her throne should never be made a subject of discussion. It would cause disputes as to the validity of this or that marriage, in allusion to the old dispute of Henry VIII's marriage with her mother, which was, in truth, the source of Elizabeth's jealousy of all her royal kindred. Mary consented to acknowledge that the right to the English crown was vested in Elizabeth and her posterity, if, in return, Elizabeth would declare her claims to the succession as presumptive heiress. Elizabeth in reply said, that she could not do so without conceiving a dislike to Mary, and asked, how it were possible for her to love any one whose interest it was to see her dead? She enlarged withal on the inconstancy of human affections and the proneness of men in general to worship the rising sun. It was so in her sister's reign, she said, and would be so again if she were ever to declare her successor. It was then proposed that the two queens should meet and settle their differences in an amicable manner. Mary, with the confiding frankness that marked her character, agreed to come to York for this purpose, and a passport was even signed for her and her retinue of 1,000 horse. And when Elizabeth, for some reason, postponed the meeting to an indefinite time, the young sovereign of Scotland, in her romantic infatuation, wept with passionate regret at her disappointment. Elizabeth had at this time much to harass and disquiet her. The expedition which she had been persuaded to send out to the shores of Normandy had been anything but successful. Much treasure and blood had been uselessly expended, and the city of Rouen, after it had been defended with fruitless valour, was taken by the royalist forces, and 200 brave English auxiliaries put to the sword. On Lord Robert Dudley the unwelcome task devolved of imparting the news of this misfortune to her majesty. He had the presumption to conceal the fact that the city had actually fallen, but represented it to be in great distress, and artfully persuaded his royal mistress, that if the worst happened, her parsimony would have been the cause. Elizabeth was in an agony at the possibility of such a calamity, and dispatched reinforcements and supplies to Warwick, with a letter of encouragement from her council, to which she added the following affectionate postscript in her own hand. My dear Warwick, if your honour and my desire could accord with the loss of the needfullest finger I keep, God so help me in my utmost need, as I would gladly lose that one joint for your safe abode with me. But since I cannot, that I will do, that I may and will rather drink in an ashen cup, than you and yours should not be succoured, both by sea and land, and that with all possible speed, and let this my scribbling hand witness to them all. Yours as my own, E.R. There is an honest and generous warmth in this brief note, which does Elizabeth more honour than all her laboured, metaphorical, epistolary compositions. She felt what she wrote in this instance, and the feeling, that she would rather drink out of an ashen cup than her suffering soldiers, on foreign service, should want succour, is worthy of being inscribed on her monument. The supplies could not prevent the secret negotiation between the royalists and the Huguenots, by which the English allies were sacrificed. The plague breaking out in the garrisons of Newhaven and Havre de Grace caused such ravages that the Earl of Warwick found himself compelled to surrender hard to the French, and brought the sickly remnant of his army home. They brought the infection with them, and 20,000 persons died in the metropolis alone. The pestilence lasted nearly a year, which caused the queen to withdraw her court to Windsor. The approach of the maiden monarch was hailed by the youthful classics at Eton with rapturous delight, and in the fervour of their loyal enthusiasm they proclaimed an ovation to Queen Elizabeth, and offered their homage in every variety of Latin verses and orations, which were very graciously received by her majesty. Elizabeth was always on the most affectionate terms with this royal nursery of scholars, was much beloved and honoured by them. Cecil in his diary proudly recalls the fact that the Queen's Majesty on the 6th of July, 1564, stood for his infant daughter, to whom she gave her own name. Lady Lennox appears not only to have obtained her liberty at that time, but to have regained her standing at court, as First Lady of the royal blood. For we find that she assisted her Majesty on that occasion as the other godmother. The same summer, the Queen decided on visiting the University of Cambridge, at the request of Sir William Cecil, who, in addition to his other high offices, was also Chancellor of this University. He was unluckily attacked with what he termed an unhappy grief in his foot, no other than a painful fit of the gout. just at the time when he was nervously anxious that all things should be arranged, in the most perfect manner, for the honour of his sovereign and alma mater. The energy of his mind prevailed over the malady so far, that he went with his lady in a coach, on the 4th of August, to overlook the preparations for her majesty's reception. The next day the queen came from Mr. Worthington's house at Hastingfield, where she had slept on the preceding night. She was met by the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl of Sussex, the Bishop of Ely, and an honourable company, by whom she was conducted towards the town. The mayor and corporation met the sovereign a little before Newnham, and there alighted and performed their devoir, and the recorder made an oration in English. Then the mayor delivered the mace with a fair standing cup, which cost £19, and 20 old angels in it, which her majesty received, gently returned the mace to the mayor, and delivered the cup to one of her footmen. When she came to Newnham Mills, being requested to change her horse, she alighted, and went into the miller's house for a little space. Then she and all her ladies being remounted, proceeded in fair array, and as they neared the town, the trumpeters by solemn blast declared her majesty's approach. When they entered Queen's College, and her majesty was in the midst of the scholars, 2 appointed for the purpose knelt before her, and kissing their papers, offered them to her grace. The queen, understanding that they contained congratulatory addresses in prose and verse, received and delivered them to one of her footmen. When they reached the doctors, all the lords and ladies alighted, her majesty only remained on horseback. She was dressed in a gown of black velvet pinked, or cut velvet, and had a caul upon her head, set with pearls and precious stones, and a hat that was spangled with gold, and a bush of feathers. When her majesty came to the west door of the chapel, Sir William Cecil kneeled down and welcomed her, and the beadles kneeling, kissed their staves, and delivered them to Mr. Secretary, who, likewise kissing the same, delivered them to the queen's hands, who could not well hold them all, and her grace gently and merrily redelivered them, willing him and the other magistrates of the university to minister justice uprightly, or she would take them into her own hands, and see to it, adding, that though the chancellor halted, his leg being sore, yet she trusted that justice did not halt. All this time Elisabeth was on horseback, and before she alighted came Master W. Masters, of King's College, orator, making his 3 reverences, kneeling down on the first step of the west door, which was with the walls outward, covered with verses, and made his oration, in length almost half an hour, in effect as follows. First, he praised many and singular virtues set and planted in her majesty, which her highness not acknowledging, bit her lips and fingers, and sometimes broke into passion, and interrupted with these words, Non est veritas. But the orator, praising virginity, she exclaimed, God's blessing on thine heart, there continue. When he had finished, the queen much commended him, and marvelled that his memory did so well serve him to repeat such divers and sundry matters, saying, that she would answer him again in Latin, but for fear she should speak false Latin, and then they would laugh at her. But in fine, in token of her contentment she called him to her, offered him her hand to kiss, and asked his name. She was lodged in King's College, the best chambers and gallery being devoted to her use. The fellows of King's resigned their monastic dormitories for the accommodation of Lady Strange and the fair maids of honour of the Virgin Queen. The next day was Sunday, and the queen went in great state to King's College Chapel. She entered at the litany under a canopy, carried over her head by 4 doctors of divinity. Dr. Perne preached the sermon, and when he was in the midst of it, her majesty sent the Lord Hunsdon to will him to put on his cap, which he wore to the end. At which time, ere he could leave the pulpit, she sent him word by the Lord Chamberlain, that it was the first sermon she had ever heard in Latin, and she thought she could never hear a better. When the music of the choir concluded, she departed by the private way into the college, the 4 doctors bearing her canopy. At evening prayer, the queen was not expected at chapel, therefore the singing commenced, but, being informed her majesty was then coming through the private passage, it stopped, and when she was seated in her traverse, evensong commenced anew, which ended, she departed by her usual way, and went to the play. This by the Protestants who surrounded Elisabeth, must have been considered a desecration of the Sabbath evening, if Cambridge did not at that time follow an ancient practice, prevalent in some parts of Europe, where the Sabbath was considered to commence on the Saturday evening, and to end on the Sunday after evening prayer. The customs and manners of an age and people must always be considered charitably, before violent blame is incurred, and it is possible, from so many traces that exist of Elizabeth's uproarious mode of spending our Sabbath evening, that some reckoning of time was in vogue in her days. She went to see one of Plautus's plays, the Aulularia, for the hearing and playing of which, at her expense, a vast platform was erected in King's College Church. The performance of a pagan play in a Christian church on the Sunday evening was no great improvement on the ancient moralities and mysteries, which, in retrospective review, are so revolting to modern taste. Those who glance over the mysteries must feel displeased at finding that sacred subjects could be so absurdly dramatized. Yet these mysteries were listened to with a reverential awe by a demi-savage people, who saw nothing ridiculous or profane in the manner of showing the creation, the history of Noah or of Joseph, the intention being to make them comprehensible to the eye, when the untaught ear refused to follow the thread of sacred history. But Elizabeth and Cambridge had more knowledge, if not more wisdom, and ought to have banished their pagan play from the walls of a Christian temple. When all things were ready in the church for this play, the Lord Chamberlain and Cecil came in with a multitude of the guard bearing staff torches, no other lights being used at the play. The guard stood on the ground, bearing their torches on each side of the stage, and a very curious pictorial effect must the glaring torchlight have thrown on the groups of spectators standing or sitting among the pillars and deep Gothic arches of that church playhouse. At last the Queen entered with her ladies and gentlewomen, Lady Strange carrying her train, and the gentlemen pensioners preceding her with torch staves. She took her seat under a canopy of state, raised on the south wall of the church opposite to the stage, where she heard out the play fully, till 12 o'clock, when she departed to her chamber in the order that she came. The next day the Queen attended the disputations at St. Mary's Church, where an ample stage was erected for the purpose. All the scholars had been ordered previously to enclose themselves in their colleges and halls. None but those who had taken a degree were permitted to appear, and among these great inquisition was made regarding dress, for the Queen's eyes had been roaming during sermon time the preceding day over the congregation, and she found sharp fault with sundry ragged and soiled hoods and gowns. Likewise she was displeased that some of the doctors' hoods were lined with white silk, and some with miniver. At the ringing of the university bell the Queen's Majesty came to her place with royal pomp. As she passed, the graduates kneeled, and cried modestly, "Vivat Regina," and she thanked them. She then questioned the Chancellor, her minister Cecil, on the degrees and differences of every person present. The question whether monarchy were better than a republic was the leading subject of the disputation, which was moved by the celebrated Dr. Caius. But, as the voices of the three doctors who disputed were low, the Queen repeatedly called to them, "Loquamini altius." But finding this did no good, she left her seat and came to the edge of the stage, just over their heads, yet she could hear little of the disputation. Her own physician, Dr. Hykes, a doctor of the college, decided the disputation, with whom her Majesty merrily jested when he asked license of her grace. After his oration concluded, the Queen departed merrily to her lodging, about 7 o'clock. At 9 she went to another play, acted in the church, called Dido. Her entertainment at King's ended next evening with another play in English, called Ezechias, and she liked her entertainment so well, that she declared if there had been greater provision of ale and beer, she would have remained till Friday. Her visit to Cambridge was however not concluded. She was entertained at various colleges, and at Christ's received a pair of gloves, in memory of her great grand dame, Lady Margaret, the foundress, mother of Henry VII. As she rode through the street to her lodging, she talked much with divers scholars in Latin, and, at alighting from her horse, dismissed them in Latin. The day before she quitted Cambridge, at the conclusion of a disputation in St. Mary's Church, The Duke of Norfolk and Lord Robert, kneeling down, humbly desired her majesty to say somewhat in Latin, who at first refused. Mark, she had a set Latin oration ready, prepared, and conned by heart for the occasion, and said, that if she might speak her mind in English, she would not stick at the matter. But understanding by Mr. Secretary that nothing might be said openly to the University in English, she required him rather to speak, because he was Chancellor, and the Chancellor is the Queen's mouth. Whereunto he answered, that he was not her Chancellor, but Chancellor of the University. Then the Bishop of Ely kneeling, said, that 3 words of her mouth were enough. So being pressed on every side, she complied, and made a very sensible speech, in which, among other things, she raised the expectations of the University with respect to some royal foundation, which, however, she never thought fit to gratify. Her speech began thus: although womanly shamefacedness, most celebrated University, might well determine me from delivering this my unlaboured oration before so great an assembly of the learned, yet the intercession of my nobles and my own good will towards the University impels me to say somewhat. It contained 9 other sections. The conclusion was, it is time, then, that your ears, which have been so long detained by this barbarous sort of an oration, should now be released from the pain of it. At this speech of the Queen's, the auditors, being all marvellously astonished, brake forth in open voice, Vivat Regina! But the Queen's Majesty responded with this shout, Taceat Regina! And moreover wished, all those who heard her had drank of the Lethe. She departed from Cambridge on the 10th of August, passing from King's College by the schools. Dr. Perne, with many of the University, knelt, and in Latin wished her Majesty a good journey. To whom she mildly answered with a distinct voice, Valete omnes, farewell all. The Master of Magdalen was ready with the Latin oration of farewell, which she declined on account of the heat of the day, and rode forward to dinner at the Bishop of Ely's house at Stanton. All the benefaction she bestowed on this visit was £20 per annum to a handsome student who had acted Dido much to her satisfaction. End of Section 15.